All right. Let's let everyone trickle in. Welcome, welcome. We'll kind of give us about 10, 15 seconds, 16 seconds. I don't know. And we'll let people trickle in before we get started. Jeff, are you actually in Los Angeles right now, or do you just put the Los Angeles thing up there?
No, I'm actually in San Francisco today, so I'm in the Bay Area for one day.
Great. Are you up there for Dreamforce, or are you just
Yeah, gonna stop by Dreamforce and Ops Stars real quick.
great?
So yeah, won't be a lot. I have a lot of meetings, unfortunately, so I'm gonna like pop in, pop out, head to a WeWork.
Yep, makes sense. I think that's what a lot of people are doing. That's just like the nature of Dreamforce. So anyway, let's get started. Um, First introductions. Welcome to the Fireside Chat. I'm your host, Tyler Simons. I'm head of customer success at Fullcast. We are a go-to-market planning and execution platform, and I am chiming in from the northern Italy area tonight. Well, tonight for me and probably midday for everybody. With us today, we have Jeff Ignacio with Regrow Ag. Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're up to?
Yeah, thanks. I'm also joining from Northern California today. Normally based out of Southern California. I'm a little jealous that you're in Italy and I'm not. Yeah, so a little bit about me. I work at Regrow Ag. We're a climate-focused agricultural technology company focused on measuring Scope 3 emissions in the agricultural supply chain. So we're trying to track different abatements or emission factors, like how much carbon we're sequestering up and down different food supply chains. My role is leader of go-to-market operations and growth. So I focus on a couple of key pillars: enablement, process improvement, advisory, and reporting. So really looking at our reporting and metrics, as well as our systems infrastructure. For the last 10 years, I've been in revenue operations at VC-backed growth startups. So there's always a difficult mandate to try to grow and double year on year. Then prior to that, I was in a career in FP&A.
Awesome. All right. These things are short, so we're going to get right into it. Today, we're going to talk a little about, hopefully what we call the recovery or the rebound, or, maybe, everything was perfect and I was just dreaming about these last 6 months. But, is RevOps really calling this rebound? And we're getting into this like planning time, right? And so everyone's starting to think about 2024 and, do we add headcount? Do we really like step on the pedal and go for this? And so, we have you on to really just help us figure out, like, ask these, what are the types of questions that we want to ask? And particularly, I think where I really want to start, and, we first were talking, June timeframe when we were talking about this idea, and things have changed even since June. And so I want to understand, just like what sort of trends have you been seeing out there in the economy and in the industry?
So I think a couple of things. We go back to 2020 with COVID and its impact on supply chains, and then the kind of the M2 money supply growing and inflation really running rampant, and the Fed really trying to curtail or curb that runaway inflation by increasing interest rates, the Fed funds rate. So we moved away from a ZIRP environment, the zero interest rate policy, to kind of what's considered normal. For those of us who've only been working for 10 years, you probably have never seen anything like this. If you've been working for 20 like me, you've probably seen at least the version of business beforehand. And so as we move into this new climate, how did everyone react? Everyone decided to start cutting. And where they cut, the easiest places would be to cut, yeah, low performers. But most businesses don't have enough low performers to get their costs in line, so they had to start cutting deeper than that. And so they started either cutting deep with precision or they did it indiscriminately. For many of the companies who kind of cut indiscriminately, and for the folks who were impacted, it was a difficult time, I think. It shifted the burden on the remaining staff. So for those of us who, survived the layoff, on one hand, you're saying, "Oh my goodness, I'm glad I'm safe," but at the same time, you're like, "Wait, my workload just tremendously increased, and by some measures, maybe doubled, some cases tripled. You're
Yep.
taking on more jobs. than you ever thought possible. You joined the startup thinking you were going to wear multiple hats, but you didn't realize you were going to wear this many hats. And so, when we think about that, it did a couple of things. The customers who were all cutting decided not to purchase new spend. So that spend went downwards and maybe delayed some certain investments for those companies. And then secondly, you probably saw a little bit of burnout for those businesses. And now you're seeing a little bit of unpreparedness for the kind of hopefully a new pivot for the businesses that were kind of trying to tighten their belts for the last couple of quarters. So a couple of trends that I've seen: longer sales cycles, lower win rates, increasing losses to no decision or no budget. And those are two things that, you can work around in your objections, but quite frankly, you can't really push a company to buy when they're just not in a great position. But now we've been in this for about a year. I think these businesses have really stomached that changed environment, and the problems that they needed to solve haven't gone away. In fact, they've magnified. And so now is a perfect time to start revisiting some of those lost opportunities, going back to them and seeing how's that worked out for you. Has the pain stayed static? Has it gone away? And I think the result you'll get speaking with your prospects is no, it hasn't. In fact, it's only magnified.
Yeah. What do you think that, like, I mean, I'm just really focused. Obviously, I'm just been really focusing on the planning front, right? And from a company perspective, as they think about the go to market for next fiscal year, what are the questions that they should be asking for their analysis? Like, what's that approach that, like, okay, are we really, because you actually hit on this where you said, they're actually feeling maybe a little unprepared for this potential turnaround or the change in economy. But I mean, maybe it's actually early for their go to market. And how do they actually figure that out, right? Like, what are those questions that they're asking, or the data that they should be looking at to kind of just see, what should we be doing for next fiscal?
I think a couple of things to look at. What's the TAM? What does the TAM look like? Is it a TAM in recovery? Secondly, within that TAM, what are the ICPs that we want to go after? In 2022, 2021, we've consolidated those ICPs down to, our A list or our tier ones, and
Yeah.
we truncated one for one investment in tier twos, right? We weren't going to go outbound in those tier twos. You were going to hopefully have them come inbound, or go through channel partners. But for next year, you start looking at any green shoots, like where were those two tier twos or those industries on the fringe that you used to sell to that disappeared wholesale, but are now starting to tick back up. Now you have a decision to make. Do you reinvest in that area? It's kind of an experiment that you already know about. You probably have some messaging. You probably have some customers under your belt. And so, do you add that to your enablement playbook for the following year to go after those new segments? That'd be one piece. Second piece is kind of internal, right? You've had a rough ride with a team that you have. How do you reward those team members for sticking it out? So, what does that look like? Is that come in the form of a more generous territory? Does that come in the form of a promo path? Does that come in the form of a skill set augmentation? So those are some things that I would look at on the internal side. Now, in addition to the ICP, in addition to the personas, we need to resource how we go after those correctly. So what does the composition of your territories look like? Are you going to give a smattering of 80% tier ones, 20% tier twos, on a one-to-one basis, meaning you're going outbound, with maybe pairing that with an ABM strategy, and then everything else is probably going to come outside of that, and maybe leave that to inbound. So I think a couple of things: you're going to expand the book that you can go after next year more so than you did this year. This year was all about concentration, all about focus. Also, on the existing customer side of the house, we were doing two things. We were, one, trying to prevent churn as much as possible. And in the course of preventing churn, we actually found that many companies were just downgrading. And the
Yeah.
reason they were downgrading is if you had a seats model or a consumption model, they may not have consumed or may not have had the same number of licenses that they needed in the past, particularly if you're selling into like a software or a SaaS space. And so when we think about next year, are these companies primed for growth? And if they are, does that bring back, wins behind the sale for that seat in that consumption-based model?
Yeah. There's like a component of upsell. So depending on, who's whether that's like your account executives or you have like a renewal team. As you think about like upsells and renewals, there's going to be increases there that would essentially require more effort, more work to capitalize on that. And then, it was interesting. You had also brought up like close loss opportunities, and I feel like there's probably enough of those out there for this this last year that you could even look at like, well, what is the sum of that, and how much of it, like how many reps could actually just work close lost opportunities. I mean, this is kind of a wild idea, but like I just am like thinking of, I always like try to think in terms of like, how do I quantify like the dollar value or the potential, right? It's not just like tier one and tier two, and it goes back similar to like TAM, but just what is that potential of each count? And then as we kind of build that up to look at, well, what can we sell next year, right? What's that real potential for next year? And then head count that can support that or close that deal. So I just coming back to just like locking in on those close loss opportunities, I think looking at that stuff would be super key. Now, just as we are starting to, you had also talked about like the it's this piece, and I don't, maybe there's no answer to this, right? How do you know if you're sitting here and you're in RevOps? How do you know which which customers are primed for growth, right? You had talked about that, and maybe there's like this just guess that I think these industries are going to have growth next year, or maybe they're not. But like we're still so early on that I feel like the prediction of what's going to do well and what's not going to do well next year, or what's going to be slow to recover, or what might be the win is still unclear. Is this still a guessing game? Or is there something that we could be like looking at in data to just know, hey, we had success here, and maybe we take a look at that?
There's two ways to look at it. I think some businesses have the ability to do a TAM analysis. The TAM analysis typically incorporates third party um, third party studies to look at overall segments and their growth. So, for example, if we're looking at the banking sector or the pharmaceutical sector, or you're selling to different sectors, there's got to be an analyst out there that has coverage for those specific areas. So you can look at that model, those numbers, and triangulate across what you believe is going to be that growth, and then start slicing it down to the different segments that you're selling into. That's going to be an assumption, but it's at least it's driven by data. The second way of doing it is more intuitive, right? So you take a look at maybe your internal data and what you're hearing from the field, and
Mm,
that's going to form your kind of TAM, or where you're going to allocate your resources. Both of those models have their flaws. I trust the first model more than the second, but when you're planning, especially if you're starting late, right? So like the largest companies out there are starting to plan around August. So
yeah.
they've already kicked off their planning. For many startups, if anyone's listening to this, I guarantee you they're probably not starting until November or October. And so you've lost, 2 to 3 critical months of looking at your TAM and really providing a lot more wood behind the arrow, more data behind the scenes. So, like for example, in my business, we're looking at international coverage of commodity growth measured by land and gross production value for different crops around the world, and that data is publicly available, and we can find that and then start to look at what does the trend line look like for these different areas, and from there you can sort of guess, okay, is this going to be continuing to be a growth area for certain regions of the world?
Yep, that makes sense. What about like this notion of maybe just planning for the next 3 months? I'm making this up, but I'm just going to throw this out here and just we're going to just talk about it. What if like you're just so uncertain on all this stuff that you're just like, let's just look at what we could do Q1 and maybe Q2. Let's plan for that, and then we'll hit a button at the end of Q1, see where we're at, reevaluate, go from there. Do you think that that's going to be something that's going to happen? Is that even something that could happen?
You're talking about taking the annual planning process and chunking it up into maybe shorter
Yeah.
quarterly
Yeah, I
planning.
mean, this is so uncertain, right? Like we are starting to see trends of us getting, out of all of this. Like kick this can down the road. We're not going to buy right now. And we're starting to see that. But, is it a realistic approach to just say, let's take this one quarter at a time and reevaluate what our, what our headcount should look like, what our go to market should look like. And maybe this is what we should be doing all the time. I don't know. I'm just,
Yeah, I
you
see
know,
two versions of this. The largest companies probably have the luxury or the capability to actually do this, but then you're taxing your organization to spend a considerable amount of time of the year in planning. Like for example, at two of the largest companies I've ever worked at, we started planning in April and then August, but we just wrapped planning in January. So you're really talking about 7 to 9 months of the year planning. And so just imagine the amount of work that you're going into it. Now, I think you could probably come up with planning light, like something that is much smaller of a footprint in terms of activity. Because when you're doing your annual planning, you have discrete phases and activities, and each of those have um, you know, a couple of months, a single threaded owner behind them. Each of those work streams, probably thousands of hours worth of work from across the revenue operations team. When you're talking about a small company, the flavor that I usually see is what I call a replan. So, you're data dependent, as I guess Jerome Powell would say. He's just like data's coming in. You're starting to see that you're trending off path. You need to go back on path. You go through what's called a replan. It's usually driven by the finance org. That replan is generally a target brought downwards. And I think you've probably seen that quite a bit last year. So
yeah,
if the target was 20 million and halfway through the year, you realize you're like 30% off track. So then you're thinking, okay, let's give the plan a haircut a little bit, 35%. That amount of work, you can't just do that willy-nilly. You have to go through your board of directors and get it approved. So even when you're doing these plans consistently, to get anything official approved does take a bit of time. And it's also a lot of hat in hand for your executive leadership team to go to the board. Internally, you might be able to change some of the furniture or the chairs around. So you might say something to the effect of, okay, well, new business isn't working out as well as we thought. We think we have a shot at making up for it in other areas of other columns. So expansion, maybe reducing churn. So, you can start to think through maybe internal moves that you can make. You could probably do that on a quarterly basis, but to do anything official at the external level, I think it'd be very, very difficult and probably unwarranted.
yeah, makes sense. I do think, yeah, I think your latter point is actually probably where I would be at in terms of like, okay, let's watch, how each industry does, month over month, probably as we are looking in this at a recovery and just see like, okay, what's looking strong, what's not looking strong, and maybe being prepared to move resources around based on what you're seeing coming in as things start to shift. And I think that's really what, would make me personally feel more comfortable than just being flat out like unprepared or late to the game of recovery, right? You're like, well, we did all this work to get, break even or wherever we needed to get, tightening the belt. Let's not just like go add a bunch of people, but at the same time, we don't want to be so far behind that we can't catch up for next year. And there's like this point, this like middle ground slash happy ground we want to find, So anyway, what do you think that, what I guess like what considerations should RevOps take when determining how to react to this economic environment?
So it starts with planning. So this is a perfect time again, I think. So probably want to do a couple of things. As you're planning, take an opportunity to reflect on the year. And what I mean by reflect is take a look at your entire customer life cycle, look at your conversion rates across all the different stages, and look at where you performed against what you planned the year prior. And from there, you're going to be able to assess how did you perform against how you thought the year would play out. And you can see, where can you carry strength to strength for next year? And then where are your areas of weakness or opportunities for improvement? Identify what are the hypotheses for which you can improve upon them. So for example, if you were particularly weak at pipeline generation, or you had an issue moving opportunities from stage 2 to 3, or is there a particular segment that you were, really sticky at? Let's take a look at how we can improve each of those. And those are going to be initiatives that you'll want to kick off between now and the end of the first quarter. Those are going to be central themes for your annual plan or your company kickoff.
Yeah.
Uh,
You
the
think,
second,
Jeff, I'm just curious, like, do you think like just looking at last year's data is enough given how weird COVID was and maybe last year was kind of a normal-ish year since we've like come out of that? I'm just curious as to what your approach is dealing with some of the historicals from COVID.
I think the problem is if you go back a year, you go back the year before that was even more weird. Then you go
Yeah.
the year after 2021, that was a strange year as well. It was kind of a hyper buying year, growth at
Yeah.
all costs, number
Yeah.
of sectors. So how far back do you want to go? Go back to 2019?
Well, and that's
Uh,
not even relevant, right? Like,
you might not have even existed by then.
yeah.
So
Too
I would
funny.
I would be very I would use last year's data as a benchmark. Then I would consult and find third-party benchmarks for win rates for similar businesses at your stage, at your growth level. That data is hard to find, but that's the art and the science of being a revenue operator leader. You have to know your benchmarks and how you go against, how you stack up against your peers. And then from there, run the math, right? Like it's not just about conversion percentages, it's also about your customer acquisition costs and how that relates into, the expected revenue or the lifetime revenue of the customer. If your unit economics don't even line up, then you have to really think through the sensitivity scenarios on how could we get it to line up? How much of a deal cycle do we need to shrink? How much of the ASP do we need to increase? How much of the win rate do we need to improve? And then where on the cost curve can we move downwards? And for the most part, CAC is boiled down to, human capital. It's really how much you're spending on your people. And so you have to make sure that you have the right people, the right skills, and that they're performing and they're in the right leadership environment for them to succeed. So, when you really think about planning, getting that CAC right boils down to, those big rocks that I just discussed.
Yeah. Interesting. Um, Now, when you think about, and we talked a little bit about, I'm just like, I'm like sorting out this like new business world and our like expansion and upsell stuff. And I do want to talk a little bit about that because I mean, this is where I really feel like a lot of the opportunity is. And do you feel like um, there's other things that we should be looking at on the upsell and the expansion and renewal side that differs from just your standard like pipeline conversion and top of funnel and win rates and things like that?
Yeah, I think if you don't have a product or a service that customers want in the first place, you're going to have a really hard time upselling or cross-selling, even if you have world-class operating cadences, world-class sales reps. Um, the buyer is going to be wise on, I do want to expand with you or I don't. There's a couple of ways you can upsell or expand in this market. If you own a killer distribution strategy and you have a sufficiently good enough product, I think you can get away with selling a subpar product. If you have a killer product and you don't have a great distribution strategy, then the distribution would be something that I would take a look at. So, for example, you probably see this in the sales tech or the go-to-market tech stack today. You see these 5 or 6 mid-market companies really combining and acquiring all these different point solutions to create a bundled offering. And so now when you think about, okay, well, I want this capability, well, these 4 or 5 different companies own it with these four or five different solutions that were once upon a time standalone companies.
Yeah.
And so as a buyer, my ability to decide what we want starts with what requirements and capabilities do I want as a business, and then what are my deal breakers in the negotiation, and then I start to look at, okay, well, now there are probably there's less freedom in my choice now because a lot of these companies, if I buy from one, they're going to try to upsell me another solution or rip and replace something I already have. So it's an interesting place to be. And I think the first principles start with what's your product, what's your service. If it's not, if that's not like top notch, you're nice to have, not a need to have. Then you really need to think through your distribution strategy, and maybe come up with a bundled offering. Um, And then below that, I think that then it comes down to kind of what's your overall strategy and your execution.
Yeah. It also depends, like, oh, just sorry, this is a side note, but there's a blog I read. It's like, and a lot of people probably heard of this on this thing. This is called Stratechery, and he's been talking a lot about Charter and Disney Plus and all the cable company stuff. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's what Rev did me right now. It's like that's literally what all these companies are doing is they're just bundling in cable. This is the cable companies again. Anyway, uh, so I was actually thinking like it really depends also as you depends on your product offering too, right? Like if you are one of those companies that just has like, okay, I've got this one product and maybe something that is a typical add-on or cross-sell, whatever you want to call it. I think that analysis is pretty easy to do to understand, what is the potential to cross sell from this product to that product and vice versa. But then there's this other piece that what happens when you're multiple products in, and are there other, like, are specific products more complementary or easy to sell? And those are things that I think, RevOps should actually start to look at, because that's where you can start to dip your toes back into really going back after business, right? Like, okay, product A and product C, these typically go really well together. Let's really focus on that and what's our potential and kind of dig into that. I'm just curious, like, is that something you've seen before, or is that, am I just, you know, making stuff up over here?
I think if companies have multiple products in their portfolio, then an excellent strategy, obviously, is to develop a cross sell.
Yeah.
And the data, it starts with what's your product strategy? This is where working with product and product marketing can help tell the narrative around, who are potentially prime personas to go after the cross sell. If you have cross sold before, you have enough data to maybe set a benchmark for what's called an attach rate. And so once you have a baseline of customers to take a look at, you develop your roster or your list of accounts and then identify, an ICP for cross sell there, like who has a higher propensity over others. And then you can start to assign targets based on historical attach rates or a presumed intuitive attach rate, and then use that as your target for next year. Then I would galvanize the organization to drive the behavior to want to cross sell across the portfolio. It's not just about, what's your dollar target versus your plan. You should maybe consider maybe splitting your plan, your compensation plan, to have a number of dollars for product A, number of products for portfolio B, and that forces your own organization to think through their book of business and how they can sell sufficiently enough across all of your different product lines.
Yeah. Amazing. So what do you think? Are we're just gonna like just triple headcount next year? Is that where we're headed?
I don't know. I think if you were a business in 2021, 2022, and you were raising, I think you might have a hard time raising that next round. So it's, buckle up, tighten up your operations. I really don't think you're going to see a lot of businesses tripling, but it doesn't mean that there aren't growth categories. So for example, there's like a new mania with AI. I'm in a space that's quite hot now, climate tech.
Yeah.
And so, there are sectors that are growing. They could probably triple headcount because they are small categories, but that's not nearly enough to absorb like all the people that were out there. But I do think businesses are starting to um, hopefully hire, like at least from my role, like revenue operations, I'm starting to see those jobs tick back up on the job board, and I'm actually hearing from recruiters myself, and I'm referring others who I know who are looking. And so just anecdotally, I am seeing some green shoots that are out there. But I don't know if it's a tripling.
Well, I thought I'd throw it out there, but it's like I guess the last thing I think I would want to just know is like, as all these teams are going into this planning cycle, if there was just one thing that they could look at to give them their feeling of preparedness for next year and just this confidence in, like, what next year is going to be good. Do you where would you start? Where would you look? Like, the one place, maybe it's a metric, maybe it's just like TAM data, historicals? I don't know. I'm just curious. Where would you go?
I would say if you have internal sign off on the plan with your go-to-market team and your operations team, and then you also simultaneously have sign off with your board, you have this magical harmony between the two. Then I would say both internal and external are in agreement on where the business is going to go next year.
Yeah, perfect. Jeff, anything else to add? I think we're good.
Yeah, I'm good.
Over time.
Evening for you. You should probably get a glass of vino while
I
you're out
know,
there.
definitely. I have a 10-month-old that we've got to take care of, and she's still on the time change train, so she's doing pretty good.
Oh
Anyway,
man.
uh, Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time. It was really great to kind of dig into this. I'm feeling positive about next year. Hope you are as well. So thank you all for joining, and until next time. See ya.
Cheers.